English orthography. So an example coming up here. All right, so when we think about the word jumped, I'm gonna put that up there real quick. We think about it through the lens of phonology and the phonemes within that word. J, p, t. Those 5 phonemes, being aware of those phonemes and also the sequence specifically for that word jumped, right? So that's the groundwork. In order to map graphemes onto phonemes, we need to be able to analyze all the speech sounds within a word and in the correct sequence. Also, we need to know the syntax, the grammar. How is this word used? And jump, in a grammatical sense, is a verb. And we know that verbs have tenses. And in this case, this is a past tense word. We need to look at this word through morphology, which has 2 morphemes, the base word jump and the suffix ed that's pronounced t. So we have 2 meaningful parts as well. And of course, we need to be aware of the past tense of that t sound with that stable morpheme spelling of ed. So when we are teaching spelling, we are also teaching it through these layers of language. We're teaching the phonology, we're teaching the part of speech for this word, we're teaching the morphemes, we're teaching the tenses and how they're represented. Words that end in ed are perfect examples of our morphophonemic language. And there's just one more click there and then we'll go on. And we spell that with an ed because of course, ed is a morpheme that's a stable spelling, but phonology has an influence on how it's pronounced. So we're teaching all these layers of language, not in isolation, but integrated. And they're always going to show up in students' spelling. They're going to reveal what students know about the phonology, the speech sounds within the word. They're going to reveal what they know about the orthography, the correct graphemes that represent those phonemes, and of course, the morphemes that represent the word as well. We can go on to the next one. Thanks. Okay, so another quick right. When you think about English, English is, just do a quick right wherever you are when you hear this term. It's like a sentence frame. Finish that sentence. English is, and you could even put it in the chat if you want to. And then maybe Amanda, and we can, I know before I knew better, I used to say English is crazy, but now I know better. So I wonder what you're writing. So English is morphophonemic. Perhaps you're writing that. Morpho meaning that we spell by both meaning, the morpho, and phonemic by sound. We have a morphophonemic language. We spell by meaning and we spell by sound. And we spell by 5 principles of spelling. So here we go. These are the 5 principles of spelling. I see a lot of rows in there like that. We spell by sound symbol correspondences, which means we map phonemes, sounds, to symbols, graphemes, letter and letter patterns that represent phonemes. We spell with orthographic conventions with those scribes that put these conventions on us, and by syllable types. We spell by position in a word. Where the phoneme falls in a word will determine many times how we will spell that phoneme with a grapheme. And we spell by meaning, as you saw in the word jumped, we had 2 morphemes. And the language of origin will also, its etymology, where the word originated from, will also influence how we spell it, right? So we are a robust melting pot English language. We've borrowed from many, many languages, and that will also influence how we spell words. So those are the 5 principles. So when we think about these principles, let's just go a little bit deeper. Sound symbol correspondences, meaning that we represent phonemes like with graphemes. But our language is a deep orthography, not a shallow one, where there's a one-to-one correspondence. When I always see make this sound, it's always spelled with an M. If that would be a shallow orthography. But you can see from on our screen here that we can spell in many different ways. We have a deep orthography. And of course, when we think about our vowels, there are many ways to spell our vowels. So not only do we need to be aware of the speech sounds of phonemes, we also need to know how those phonemes are represented in graphemes in English language. So that's sound symbol correspondence. Next up, position in a word. Where a phoneme falls within a word is going to tell us how it will be spelled with a grapheme. So an example might be, we're going to see here in just a moment, the O-I and the O-I, right? So we know the diphthong, oi, if we hear it at the beginning of a syllable and word, it's going to be spelled, and in the middle of a word, it's going to be spelled with an O-I. Boil, for example, or oil begin with an O-I. But if a boy is boiling, since the oi is at the end of the syllable, at the end of the word, it's going to have an O-I. And that's all about position, right? So there is an understanding of how we spell, and one of them is position. Next up is orthographic conventions. Again, as you can see, over centuries, scribes did change our language in some ways to reflect these conventions, the 6-syllable types, but also some unique ones, for example, where no English word ends in a V or a J or a U and a Q. So those are some conventions that constrain spelling. Again, morphemes. Morphemes are spelled stably. As you can see in this example, we have duck or duct, meaning to lead. And so the morpheme is pointing to the meaning of the word, and it remains stable. But depending on the phonemes around it, it can change how it's pronounced. So induction, education, deductive, the morpheme remains the same, but the pronunciation can shift. But it's important because that helps us understand the meaning of the words that we're reading and spelling. And then last but not least, language of origin. Where the word originated from will often determine how it's pronounced. So for example, if just the grapheme CH, if the word has an Anglo-Saxon origin, we'll pronounce it ch, as in church. If it has a French origin, CH might be pronounced sh, as in machine. And if it has a Greek origin, we're going to hear that k, as in chlorophyll. So same spelling, but the pronunciation is influenced by its language of origin. As I said, we're a melting pot. So when we think about our language, really only 4% of our words are true spelling oddities. We don't necessarily put them into binary piles, regular and irregular. They're really on a continuum. And so, for example, words like mop, very regular and how we would expect it to be spelled. And then less predictable would be a word like of, right? So just on this predictability, as you can kind of see that scale. And our oldest words from the Anglo-Saxon, Old English, those words oftentimes are the ones that are a little bit trickier. Their pronunciation has shifted over hundreds of years. And so that's what makes it sometimes challenging. But of course, we always want to be teaching those words and all words with letter sound correspondences so they can be orthographically matched. So those are the 5 principles of spelling, and I really want you to try to hold those in your memory because we'll be coming back to them as we analyze these spelling samples that you'll see.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the why. So why do we teach spelling? Here's a couple of points that we've already shared. English is more predictable than most people think. And so we shared with you the 5 principles that Pam reviewed. And those are guides that students can help understand English language and how it works more deeply. Another bonus is that the correlation of spelling to reading comprehension is very strong, which is really exciting. So we have a correlation that ranges from 0.66 to 0.99, which is dancing on the moon range, right? And you can look at some of those research pieces in the Wakelet. How words cast their spell is a must read if you haven't read Louisa's article on that. So we know that the more deeply and thoroughly a student knows a word, the more likely he or she is able to recognize, spell, define, and use it appropriately in speech and writing. So we're going to take a look at that statement and take it back, right? We're going to take back that English is crazy and change it into what some of you put in the chat of English is complex, right? It's sometimes difficult. But we want to try to avoid talking about exceptions and focus on teaching the frequent and reliable patterns of English. So that's our goal for instruction. So if we're looking at some of those struggling spellers and readers, oftentimes poor readers who are also poor spellers haven't had sufficient exposure to text to create those mental orthographic images of words that Dr. Kastner was talking about. So spelling instruction helps to move students decoding and reading fluency forward and to that proficient range. We also know that individual differences in spelling can explain word level and text level composition across grades 1 through 7. So this spans a large range of ages here. And so we wanted to share Gentry and Graham's statement that spelling must be taught and not caught. And our focus today is on assessment and utilizing assessment to drive instruction. But we wanted to be sure to note that we're operating under an assumption that there's an effective core spelling instruction in place, and that strong core instruction includes solid language foundations along with explicit instruction in decoding and encoding of the language. And those should be partnered through our instruction. So how should we teach spelling? We're going to follow a structured literacy framework for integrating the elements of language. So those elements include evidence-based principles and practices such as explicit instruction, systematic instruction, and diagnostic assessment. Instruction should link those modalities together of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and teaching spelling and morphology should follow a scope and sequence. For teaching sound symbol correspondences, orthographic patterns, syllables, morphemes, and also analysis of regularly and irregularly spelled words. So teaching decoding and spelling together can be mutually beneficial because it provides that multiple exposures to the graphophonemic patterns of the language. So spelling should be integrated into that writing instruction that you're doing. It's one of those micro skills of transcription that is necessary for students to be able to write effectively. So effective reading instruction requires teaching all the elements according to the structured literacy principles. And in order to deliver that type of instruction, students need to have knowledgeable teachers. There's a lot to know about the language. And we have to be keen observers, as Louisa Moats would say, of student behavior that can help us drive our instruction. So as most of you probably know, Louisa and colleagues have developed the professional development series Letters, and that is Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling. That is helping to fill the gaps in pre-service learning. If you want to know more about what you should know as a teacher, I highly recommend going to IDA's Knowledge and Practice Standards and taking a look at what we should know in order to teach these concepts. And the link for that document is also in the Wakelet. So according to structured literacy, we know framework, we know that research is showing that spelling instruction in the classroom should have a basic set of parameters. And so the evidence is showing that if we have a framework, we should have a review of previously learned concepts. The lesson could take approximately 30 to 40 minutes, depending on what you're teaching. And they would consist more or less of these steps in order. A review, oral language and connection to phonemic awareness, phonology, explicit instruction. So just give a shout out to Dr. Anita Archer. If you don't know her name, you need to write that down and watch her keynote. And then we have our practice. We have teacher-led practice and some activities here that we are going to try to focus on one or two of those today in our quick time frame. So we have teacher-led practice, and then we have supervised practice with corrective feedback, and then getting into some dictation. If you are doing dictation regularly in your spelling work, please write that down and set that as a goal for next year. And then always connecting to text. We want to read text that have those patterns that we've been teaching and practicing so that students can see that application. And then finally, a written component connected to the meaning of the text that you've read. And this comes directly from Louisa's Speech to Print, new 3rd edition. So you can see more about that in her text. And then we assess, provide corrective feedback, and continue to support students with practice. So it is necessary to have a scope and sequence. So if your school doesn't have a scope and sequence, or a program that follows a scope and sequence, you can take a look at the Keys to Literacy published scope and sequence. There's no universally agreed upon scope and sequence, but any logically ordered sequence begins with basic concepts and progresses to more difficult concepts building on prior knowledge. And that's from Susan Carricker. So some of our sequences differ among phonics programs, but we should always be looking at phonics and spelling as connected, at least through K2. So we'll take a look quickly at assessing spelling, the what, why, and how. And this is just a general overview of some of the assessment components for spelling. So we are going to focus on qualitative spelling inventories today. And spelling inventories consist of lists of words that are chosen to represent a variety of spelling features at increasing levels of difficulty. So they're planned out to focus on those patterns that we can teach and that are utilitarian. So we are going to use several spelling samples today from students, real students, and take a look at how their performance can help us drive instruction. So an advantage of an inventory is to reduce some of those working memory loads compared to evaluating a writing sample. So we're taking out the construction composition layer of working memory and other synapses that have to be firing to do that, and just focused on spelling from dictation. And that gives us a better idea with a set sample of words that we're looking for those patterns. So we can embed this inventory into any phonics spelling word program, and it can be adapted to those linguistic elements that you are teaching. So these are formative assessments that help us drive instruction and give us insight into students' command of the English language and their mastery of what has been taught. And we'll take a look at that later in the session. So we want to monitor overall progress, and you can administer this inventory up to 3 times per year to look at growth and those features of the orthography. So on this slide, you just have several different types of assessments that are available for spelling. We have screeners, norm referenced assessments, and also some diagnostic tools that you could find and have available for students. So there are a variety of those assessments, but today we're focusing in on screening, and we'll take a look at how those inventories are typically built. They're usually built from easy to difficult, starting out with a section of CVC words with short vowels and consonants, getting into more of those complex syllable structures with multiple sounds, digraphs, blends, and then into more complicated structures for spelling and patterns, long vowel spellings, and then morphology as well. How do students add inflectional endings or suffixes or attack multisyllabic words? So that's just a general scope and sequence that you'll typically find. So that progression of an inventory should be generally aligned to your phonics and word study program. So why do we assess spelling? Again, it's to give teachers those insights of what students know, making that language visible and understanding those patterns of language. So just a review, spelling and reading are complements. And spelling usually conjures up the image of the list, right, on Monday, and assessing the list on Friday after tears and practicing at home. And we're here to propose that a spelling inventory be added to your assessment protocol to really get at what we understand about language as students. So we've uncovered some of the why, and we're looking at spelling and reading as complements. And they're both based, right, on that same underlying language skill set. But spelling is productive, and so therefore it's more demanding of students than reading. And you experienced that at the beginning of our session today. So spelling requires the attention of the details to the word's orthographic representations. And some students who read well will have specific spelling and writing difficulties, so don't let them fool you. If we don't assess spelling, these students often go undetected and they don't receive the support that they need. So the purpose of early screening, as Kelly Powell Smith and Roland Good would say, is to do something about it. And that's what we're going to try to help you with, making a plan for instruction and intervention. But we know early intervention and prevention is the key. And so we're focusing on effective best practices and instruction. And those will make the biggest difference for students with difficulties or at risk for dyslexia or other reading difficulties. So how do we administer the inventory? And there's just some basics here of guidelines on administering a spelling inventory. We want to assure students that their work isn't graded, but it will help us to design instruction. So this is a no risk situation for students, and that the inventory is helpful for the teacher to see how we can help you as the student, right? So the procedure is essentially no practicing and no studying. Say the word in a group setting, use the word in a sentence, just as Pam did, and repeat the word. So students should be repeating the word after you, and then that final piece is to be quiet. Try not to talk while students are writing, which is hard for teachers for us to do. So we want to then administer that spelling inventory, all of the items to the point where you would expect students to be able to spell. And then after we've collected those assessments, we want to use those results. So here we go with spelling is a visual record.
Thanks, Erin. So as a teacher, I really value spelling inventories because, as Dr. Louisa Moat says, spelling is a visual record of language processing. It's language written down. Spelling isn't just about being right or wrong. It's not about answer getting. It's about language. And it gives us a window into how our kids are perceiving that language. So the more we as teachers know about language, it gives us a better insight into why students are making spelling errors and how to target instruction for those mistakes. So we are going to look at sample spelling inventories, as Erin said, for second grade at the beginning of the year. Some things to think about as you're doing this is to remember to be really diagnostic and prescriptive in our instruction, because as Erin said, we want to do something with the results. It should be informing our instruction. So we're going to just take a minute, give you a minute to look at these two spelling samples, remembering that these are from the beginning of second grade. We have student 1 and student 2, and just think about if these two students have the same instructional needs, and what would you do about it? I'm just going to give you 1 minute to kind of think about that. You can, of course, throw some things in the chat as it pops up. Lots of things to look at in just a short amount of time.
Just a big picture, overall strengths and weaknesses, maybe. Teach syllable types. Most students need instruction and vowel teams, long vowel silent E. Student 2 needs PA support. Most initial sounds are identified.
So it seems like you're coming up with some really good observations and things to do. And we're going to give you even a deeper way to look through these spelling inventories and be even more diagnostic in what each of those students need. So the linguistic features of language that contribute to spelling can be thought of as sort of 3 different lenses. The phonology lens, we can determine a student's awareness of the individual phonemes in words, the number of phonemes that they can hang on to and the sequence, and whether they have any phonological confusions that are going to be needing addressed. There's a strong predictive relationship between phonemic awareness and learning to read in an alphabetic writing system. So we want to make sure that we're starting there. And then for that orthography lens, that lens can help us determine the depth of knowledge that our students have about how the language is written down, including conventions and the patterns of graphemes in English. If you think back to what Pam was sharing at the beginning about those 5 principles of spelling that she told us about. And then finally, we can look at that lens of morphology. We're going to look at our students' spelling samples to determine if they're paying attention to those meaningful parts of words like prefixes and suffixes. And these lenses sort of lend themselves to a hierarchy of basic questions that we can then ask as we're analyzing these spelling inventories. And of course, as we said, we want to start with that lens of phonology with those first 2 questions. We can ask, are all the sounds represented in my student's spelling? And then, are there any phonological confusions? Once we determine the answer to those questions, we can then go back and look through the lens of orthography. That lens, we're going to ask questions 3 and 4. Are basic letter sound connections made? And are spelling conventions in place? Things like silent E. Can they use vowel teams correctly? Do they know the doubling rule? Do they know when to use CK at the end of a word? And then finally, we want to look through the spelling inventory through the lens of morphology and checking for those meaningful parts and making sure that they're representing those correctly as well. So now we're going to actually put this view into practice with some actual samples. And again, we're going to start with that lens of phonology because that's our foundation. And we're going to ask the 2 questions, are all the sounds represented? And are there any phonological confusions? So on your screen, you'll see those 2 spelling samples. And we need to also not only frame our thinking around those lenses, but also think about grade level expectations. I want to keep in mind what's been taught in my scope and sequence already and what spelling patterns we haven't gotten to, because if the teachers haven't taught it yet, we can't expect the students to apply it yet. So we're looking at spelling samples again from the beginning of 2nd grade. And we know that CVC words and short vowels should be firmly in place for these students. We're going to check those first 5 words, which are the most basic words on our list, by asking those questions. The first question, do the students have all of the sounds represented? So let's look at that first word, mud. If I say mud, say mud, mud. If you tap that out, d. There are 3 phonemes or sounds in the word mud. And the students have a grapheme for each phoneme. If we look at the words 2 through 5, we see that they are consistently representing all of the phonemes in those CVC words. So the answer to our first question is yes, the students are representing those sounds, all of the sounds in words. And now we can ask this question number 2, is there evidence of any phonological confusion in their spellings for these 3 phoneme words? No. The students have a grapheme for each sound, and those graphemes are accurately represented. Excuse me. So both students have a solid understanding of how to spell those simple closed syllable words, and they're both representing those vowels correctly. Okay. We want to keep in mind, though, that CVC words are not the only words that our students have been taught. Blends or constant clusters should be a solid skill that they have by the end of 1st grade as well. So we want to continue to look down the samples and we start to notice some differences between the students. Once we introduce words with more than 3 phonemes, we start to see some errors coming. So let's go back to our guiding question and ask, are all the sounds represented? So if we look at word number 8 and we say stone, stone, tap that out, S-T-O-N. We know that stone has 4 phonemes or sounds in the word. Now, neither student has spelled this word correctly. However, student number 1 has represented all of the sounds or phonemes in the word stone with a grapheme, whereas student number 2 has only represented 3 sounds. Student number 2 omitted the t sound at the beginning blend. So this is a phonological error. And this type of error can be seen in several more examples as we look down student 2's sample. The student seems to struggle when there are more than 3 sounds, and this could be due to maybe limitations in the student's phonological working memory. They might be having difficulty holding on to all of those sounds in their short-term memory. But something else to note is that they are frequently missing the internal consonants in consonant blends or clusters. Like Dr. Motes was talking about earlier, there's this sort of sequence of difficulty for the position of consonants. Typically, students are able to see those first and represent the initial sound and then the final sound and that medial vowel. But when we get to words with blends, those internal phonemes are much more difficult to perceive. So our student 2 missed that internal sound of a blend in stone. They forgot the t sound or left it. And they're missing the r sound in scrape and drain and growing. So we want to pay attention to that. And we also want to note that sounds in blends, especially if they're nasals, can be very difficult for students to perceive, like the sound in the final consonant blend in number 9, right? That word is the word trunk. And you'll notice that the student left out the sounds from that final consonant cluster. So we're going to revisit this in a little bit more depth later on, but we're starting to see a profile forming for student 2. We know from these examples that student 1 is much farther in their understanding of those consonant clusters and is representing all those sounds in their spelling, while student 2 is not. So I already know that I'm going to need to address phonology in my instruction. But we also need to ask the second phonological question, because we want to know if there's also evidence of any phonological confusions for this student. So one example of a phonological confusion is represented in the word drain. I believe that's number 15. Student 2 most likely heard the j sound and misrepresented it with the letter name G. So not only do we want to address the missing phonemes by having the student practice making words, but we're also going to want to explain to students about how we spell words with those R blends, because our mouths are sort of tricking us there. So now we want to think about what we know that student 2 is having difficulties with those phonological awareness. So what's our instructional plan? So student 1 is solid with their phonology. They're representing all of those phonemes in most of their words. Student 2 is the one who has some phonology concerns. They're not representing all of the sounds in blends. So one thing that we could do is use a strategy like simultaneous oral spelling to represent all of those sounds in blends. So we're going to take an opportunity now to do a little think then jot. We're kind of turning it over to you to do a we do here. And we're going to look at a new spelling sample. This is in your handout on page 5. There's a sort of phonology worksheet there. If you want to look at this new sample and sort of pick out which words you think need support in phonology, then you're going to write which word they spelled that they made a phonological error. Was it an omission or was it a confusion? And any extra information you note about that spelling error. So I'm just going to give you a few moments to take a look at that. And of course, as always, feel free to throw some in the chat. Okay, so these are the phonological mistakes that you might have noticed in pink. Anything that has some sort of phonological either omission or confusion is going to be highlighted there. We kind of chose to pull out 3 examples for you to see how that worksheet kind of works with this sample. So we chose to use the word champ. The student spelled it C-H-A-P. They omitted that nasal in that end blend. The word trunk, they did the same thing. They're omitting a nasal from the final blend. And then in the word drain, they omitted the R in the blend. And they also have that confusion with the J sound for that DR blend and that sort of affrication that we're going to talk about in more depth in just a few moments. So now that we know our students have a need stemming from a phonology issue, what instructional practices are we going to use with students who are experiencing some of these difficulties at that phonological layer of our language? Well, when we're planning instruction with phonological focus, teacher knowledge is really key, as we've kind of reiterated throughout. It's our biggest weapon against those phonological errors. Knowing the sound system of our language and the types of mistakes we can expect our students to make is key so that we can plan ahead for them and also have the greatest impact in our intervention if that's necessary. So in order for students to make any progress in reading or spelling, it's really necessary and crucial for them to have that solid phonemic awareness. We need to teach them how to take a word that's presented orally and segment it into those individual phonemes or speech sounds. And Louisa Moats sort of explains this as when we do that orally, we're creating parking spots for those letters to sort of map onto. So there are some instructional techniques that can help. We want to focus our students' attention on the articulatory gestures. How do the sounds feel and look? What's that airflow involved in the production? We want to be sure that when we introduce new phonemes or spelling patterns, that we begin with widely contrasting sounds so that those sounds look and feel different and they're not so easily confused. And we want to also give students lots of practice segmenting words into those individual phonemes or speech sounds and using some instructional routines like simultaneous oral spelling or phoneme grapheme mapping, which you can find more about in the Wakelet. And again, this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are some strategies that can be really powerful and can make a big difference for students who are struggling with that phonological layer. So now we're just going to go into just a little bit more depth with just a few of those. So remember, the first thing that we want to ask ourselves is if the student's representing all of the sounds in words. So in this example on the screen, the answer would be no. The student has omitted that nasal in the word champ. So as I said, those end blends with nasals can be particularly difficult for students to perceive. And so we often see that they omit them in their spellings. So we want to make sure that our students are noticing every sound in the words, so we can correct this nasalization error by having the students hold their nose if there's a nasal in the word. So if you say and hold your nose, you can't make that sound if you hold your nose because the airflow comes through your nose. So if you have a word that has that nasal in there, you want to hold your nose to sort of draw their attention into that sound. But something else we can do is use SOS, or simultaneous oral spelling routines. When we do this, we want to draw our students' attention to our mouths as much as possible and also their own mouths. So if you have mirrors for your students, that's always a great tool to have on hand. The smaller the mirror, the better. And so students are going to be asked to watch the teacher's mouth. So watch my mouth. Our word is champ. The student would say that word then and watch themselves in the mirror, champ. The students can then tap out the words, the sounds or phonemes in the word, or they can build it. Ch, a, m, p. Then they're going to write those sounds while they spell it. C-H, A, M, P, the word champ. They're going to read that word back to their teacher. So that's just one example. But we also want to ask the other question about phonological confusions. And so are there any phonological confusions represented in their spelling? And we can see that because of co-articulation, that sort of mushing of sounds when we're speaking, there are sort of typical errors or typical differences in how they pronounce those sounds called allophonic variations that we can anticipate and expect students to make spelling errors as a result of that co-articulation, is how more clearly. So for example, if we have the word trunk, we hear that ch sound because it's an affrication error. So what we want to do when our students are making these errors is we want to draw our students' attention to how those sounds are articulated using the place and manner of articulation. We can use mirrors if students have a positional error. If, for example, and are very closely formed in the mouth. So we can draw our students' attention to those and to our mouths as well. Students can also make errors with airflow, such as if they were writing, I have a thin pen with the, I'm sorry. So some confusions can be with airflow, such as ch and sh. So they can have their hand in front of their mouth, or they can use a tissue. So if I say shh, that's sort of a steady flow of air. If you put your hand in front of your mouth, you can feel that shh. But if I say ch, you can feel that it's sort of a push of air. You can draw students' attention to those mistakes with their hands or tissue. And then we also have voicing errors. For example, if my student spelled the word bed with the letter P, I can have them put their hands on their throats and say B, P, to feel that voicing difference between those two phonemes. So as much as we can draw our students' attention to those sounds, the better. Okay, so as we look back at our sample that you looked at, we want to talk about that instructional plan. What would the instructional plan be for this student? Well, we want to make sure that our student is using, that we're using sound boxes with our student to make sure that they're seeing, hearing, perceiving all of those phonemes, that we can pinch those nose, because we know that our student is missing a lot of nasal sounds, and we want to make sure that they can feel that vibration coming through their nose, because that's where the airflow comes from. So now we're going to switch it over to looking back at these spelling samples through the lens of orthography.
Okay, so we begin with phonology because we cannot represent in written language phonemes that we are not analyzing. So that's really where we begin. Students do need to be able to analyze and hear every sound, every phoneme within a word in the correct sequence. Without that, it's going to be very difficult for them to map graphemes onto those phonemes. And that's really what orthography is. It's referring to the rules that govern how words are represented in spelling, right? So we map, as Tamara said, where those parking spots onto graphemes. And we think about these questions when we're looking at spelling samples and inventory through the lens of orthography. Are the spellings allowable, and are spelling conventions in place? So sub questions would be, is there a rule or pattern? Are there multiple spelling choices? And often there are. And has the student been taught the concept? As we said, it's very important to have a scope and sequence, because we cannot expect students to represent in spelling what they have not yet been taught. But these are the questions that guide us as we look through the lens of orthography. So let's look at this word stone. So are the spellings allowable? And the answer to that is no. The spelling for that long O spelling is not spelled with a letter name, it's spelled with a spelling convention. Are there multiple spelling choices? Yes, we can represent the long O spelling in many different ways. OA, O with the silent E, and so many others. And has a student been taught the concept? So if the student has been taught the concept of that VCE syllable type, we know that this is still a challenge for the student to represent in written language how the word stone is spelled with this VCE pattern. They are using a letter name to represent a letter sound. And this is a common thing we see in students as they're still learning these conventions for spelling. So go to the next one. Thank you. So we're looking again, as we said, the spelling inventory goes from least complex to most complex. We're looking now through the lens of vowel teams and orthography. So as you look at these two spelling samples, we did see quite a difference between student 1 and student 2 with phonology. But I think if you look at these samples in terms of orthography, we're seeing a bit more likeness to the students. We see student 1 and student 2 using long vowel letter names to represent long vowel sounds. So an example for goat, we're using the long O to represent the OA spelling pattern. In beat, we're using letter name E to represent the EA, and so on. We see the A for drain again. So this is a pattern that we're seeing over and over again. So knowing the scope and sequence that students have been taught in terms of vowel, consonant E and vowel teams, it's really important to understand whether the students have been taught this skill and then they're not representing it and it needs to be retaught. Again, when we look at the lens of silent E through the spelling inventory, we see, again, very similar responses from both student 1 and student 2, that they're using letter names in most cases to represent a long vowel spelling. So what do student 1 and student 2, overarching, they need to learn to discriminate between hopefully short and long vowels. They're not saying stan and lif. Right, we want to clear that up first of all, if that's happening, but they also need to know the spelling conventions required for silent E and vowel teams that represent long vowel spellings in written language. That's pretty evident when we look at those spelling samples. That's what we love about spelling samples. They are pointing, they're calling out with blinking lights. This is what I need. This is what I need to learn. Oftentimes in the traditional spelling, we mark them as right or wrong. That binary approach, which really does not inform our instruction. It's not telling us what students know about language and then what next steps we should take in instruction. So as we are running probably a little bit short on time, this is something you could do for homework. Yay, this evening. This is your page 6 in your handout. Again, we were asking you to look through the spelling sample and determine which words do you believe need some support in orthography. And then we're going to give you the answers here in just a second. And these are words that we chose that are, as you can see in trunk, we have all the phonology. We have no concerns with phonology, but we do have some concerns with spelling, right? Same thing with goat, with our vowel teams, and beat with vowel teams, drain and bridges and crutch, positional spelling there. So we can see that back to those 5 principles that I shared with you earlier, the student is having some challenges, again, with long vowel patterns, but also position, how to spell within a position of a word or syllable. So 3 that we highlight for you, of course, is trunk, slipping, and bridges. And you can see over there to the right where the errors are happening for that student. And then, of course, an instructional plan to address those errors. All right, again, also an orthographic, whoops, we're going to go on. Thanks, Erin. And we'll go on to multiple spellings for the word beat. All right, thanks, Erin. So what are some considerations with orthography, right? So we know with orthography, students need to be aware of the rules and patterns. And back to Erin's earlier suggestion, of course, and a strong one at that we teach in a structured literacy, explicit instruction and patterns, that we're not asking kids to kind of pick it up implicitly. We're teaching in an explicit way and a very systematic scope and sequence. Kids need to see the words to make those mental orthographic images. So reading words in lists, sentences, and text. So they're seeing the words and mapping the pronunciation as they see it and decode it with the visual, with the spelling, the orthographic mapping of that. For words with positional constraints, of course, we want to make sure that they are aware of those constraints, how the words are spelled by position. So for an example, long A is spelled with an AY at the end of a word or syllable, but when we hear AI, the A long vowel sound at the beginning of a word or in the middle of a syllable, of course, it's going to be spelled with an AI. So when I'm doing dictation with students, I'm making them aware, where did we hear that long A sound? Is it in the middle or is it the end of a syllable? If it's in the middle, how will we spell that? Drawing their attention to the orthographic convention of how to spell that long A by position through dictation. And then, of course, we want to assess them on novel words, not the words that we've been teaching them with. We want to see if they can transfer the learning into novel words. And then you go on to the next one. All right. One fantastic way to do that is through word chains, but you must be very intentional when you make word chains. We want to only be changing one phoneme change with a grapheme, one substitution. We're doing that because we're calling attention to the internal structure of a word and how it is spelled. So on the orange box there, you can see a word chain, ing to sing and sing to sink and sink to sunk. Again, we're changing in different positions in the beginning of a word, in the middle of a word, and the end of the word. We want to draw students' attention to the spellings of these words, oftentimes by position. And so they can see not only what these words look like and as they change. A wonderful resource for that, if you haven't been to the University of Florida Literacy Institute's resource hub, you are missing out. This blending board is one example of the many resources at UFly, but could be used for this word chaining. Also, Erin has added her amazing Wakelet to of word chaining to the overall Wakelet for this one. It's actually a do not miss. And another great resource for this is Dyslexia Logic, offers all these lists. So work smarter, not harder. Definitely check out Dyslexia Logic for these word chains. And of course, what we're teaching in phonics scopes and sequence, we want kids to read, to see these patterns over and over again. So decodable texts are a perfect choice for that because they offer many, many practice opportunities. As you saw in an earlier slide, one of the suggestions was practice. Oftentimes what's happening with kids is we are teaching it, but they're not learning it. And what is that? It's a practice gap. Students need lots and lots of practice, and decodable text is one way. So here we're looking at ways we can spell the long E spelling pattern, and they're seeing that in words, right? That they get lots of repeated practice with. So the decodable text can be your friend, just like earlier, reading and spelling, they're reciprocal, but spelling is more linguistically challenging as you learn, but they benefit one another. So get out those decodable texts for those phonics patterns you've been teaching.
And we've also linked Pam's decodable text Wakelet in there as well. So we have nesting Wakelets with lots of information for you. So there's the plan.
It's like little nesting dolls of support for you. And so these are words that we selected to focus on for orthography. As you can see, we've kind of reviewed them rather quickly, but the answers right there on the sides for the errors. And then the instructional plan is right there, the how. I think it's so important. Of course, analysis is important to know when we look at language, what we need to do, but it's the instructional plan, what to do next. And so you'll see that right there at the bottom as a resource for you. And I think I did it as quick as I could. There you go. Go, Erin.
All right. So we're just going to wrap up with morphology. And in K2, we're primarily focused on, do students have a morphological awareness? Do they know that words are made up of meaningful parts? And so if you wanted to know more about that, Deb Glazer this morning did a presentation that was over an hour on all of that. So we linked her handout also in our Wakelet. And we want to think about some morphological considerations similar to the other lenses. Are morphemes acknowledged? Usually what we see in early inventories are phonetically spelled suffixes, right? Inflectional endings in early grades. We also have to be looking at affixing rules or juncture points. Are the bases spelled correctly and recognizable? And has the student been taught the concept? So that's a big question. Is it in your scope and sequence? So we looked at a couple of these words like bridges, and all of the sounds are represented b, r, I, j, I, z, right? Logically, but really not getting at the idea that we have a base and a suffix there. And the same with walked being represented by a T, even though there are some past tense verbs that have a T spelling. So in early grades, by, again, keeping this grade appropriate lens, what should students know by now? They should be able to apply ing, ed, and es, ed, as those inflectional suffixes. And you can see the blue highlighted words have those opportunities to tell whether or not students understand that. So student 1 has a deeper understanding of ing and has applied that regularly. Also has a juncture point here for smiling, which is correct. Whereas student 2 still is phonetically spelling all of the suffixes and is spelling ing, the ing suffix, in multiple different ways. So definitely student 1 and 2 have different needs in terms of morphology. Student 1 has those inflectional endings partially in place, but student 2 needs some more consistent work with that. So this was actually a question in the chat about SOS. And so SOS at this point would be really beneficial to build in a routine where you would be doing dictation, like say the word bridges, then identify the base. So ask your students, what's the base? They would say bridge, and then we would have them write the base. And the word is bridges. What suffix do you need to add? That's an ES, and build that word and rewrite the word bridges. So that's a way that you can integrate morphology into your SOS and to clear up some of those confusions that kids have about, is it T or is it ED? And we're thinking about the whole component of the word, the meaning, right? It's a past tense verb, and the spelling and the representation there. So these are just ideas for thinking about a plan. So we can practice with SOS, and then also talking about word sums and other activities that will get at that morphological awareness component. So this is the worksheet for morphology. And basically, we want you to notice what are the options, right, for the misspellings for the words. Was it a base error? Was it a prefix error if you're working with older students, or a suffix error and or an affix rule application error? So all of those can help you guide your students in understanding what they need for additional practice. So in your worksheets, you have all of those blanks that you could take a look at, like Pam said, for homework. And we have put together for you a tool sheet that is in the handout for sort of condensing the ideas for analysis, teaching or instructional strategies, and then what student materials might you be able to use to capitalize on this corrective feedback component and planning for instruction. So in your handout as well, in the next section, you have 3 different documents that are scaffolded to help you walk through on the spot corrective feedback. Tambra walked us through some of those reflections for phonology. But here are some things that as you are dictating words in your classroom time and not just reflecting on an inventory, that you can use as a script for reference. So on the spot, immediate corrective feedback is our best tool to help students come to correction. And so these would just help you do that on the spot. So on phonemic awareness, what are the confusions and your plan, and then some scripts for each of those, phonology, orthography, and morphology. So words in your mouth that you can practice, and as you learn and practice about those errors, it will come more naturally and easily to you. So we have also at the end, I don't know, Pam, do you want to just show them what the overview looks like for the?
Sure.
Okay.
I would be glad to do that. So how do we look at the spelling inventory for scoring? We give 1 point for each word correct. We circle all the correct target skills, and then we total the final column. And so this is one of the spelling samples that you've been looking at through the course of the afternoon. And you can see the scorings to the left and right. All right. And what does that mean? What we did is we went in and we color coded. This actually, these spelling samples came from Tambra's school. Thank you very much, Tambra. So we knew the phonics scope and sequence. We knew the spelling sequence that had been taught. And so then we color coded it by what it was taught and not mastered and what has not yet been taught. So again, as we said, the importance of having a spelling scope and sequence is, you know, it's been taught. So it should have been learned. And so therefore, all the orange you see here is directing us for instruction. And of course, we would also, we don't have time to do this today, but we would also look at a composite of the entire classroom. a scoring sample so that we would know what could be taught whole group. We want to be most efficient with our time. So if we're seeing patterns in many students, it's telling us we need to be teaching that in tier 1 instruction whole group. And then of course, when we look at other students who may have similar skills, we're grouping them together for small group instruction based on data, right? Based on this data. So if there's a practice gap, as we said, which often can happen, we need more practice, right? So we need to teach and then of course reteach and using that framework that Aaron shared with us earlier, an explicit lesson framework. And Dr. Moat shared one today with you as well in the keynote that looks similar to this. And this comes from the International Dyslexia Association. Put a plug in for those knowledge practice standards again, please check them out. And I think we're getting ready. There we are. We're going to make it, Amanda. This is the summary, right? There are many layers of language. They're interwoven and spelling is governed by those 5 principles, right? We can explain almost every single word in the English language through one of those principles. And today we are looking at spelling, student spelling through phonology, orthography, and morphology. It's visible language and it's pointing the way for instruction. So we hope that you enjoyed this session. Please make sure to check out that Wakelet. Aaron worked very late last night to make that for all of you, and it's chock full of resources for this session and actually many others, so check it out. And with that, we'll say, Aaron, Tamara, and I will say thank you. That is our contact information. And Amanda will, I didn't see many questions in the chat. So maybe you're just going to share the code and all that good stuff.
We do have just a few questions, but first I'd like to thank the 3 of you, Erin Amy, Tambra Eisenberg, and Dr. Pam Kastner, and all of you who attended this session.